Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Mark Andrew Holacek, philosopher, historian, Thomas Jefferson scholar, and I'd like to welcome you to the fourth episode of The Real Thomas Jefferson. And I will like to talk about removing and toppling statues today. And the title of this talk might be considered The Argument for Preserving at least Most of Our Early American Symbols. Now, a few years ago, June 2020, there was an event in Portland, Oregon. Go figure that one, right? A group of people got together at Thomas Jefferson High School and took whatever they had, bungee cords, wires, ropes, and everything, and they wrapped them around this massive statue of Thomas Jefferson, and they pulled it to the ground and toppled it. And everybody clapped and was so excited that they removed this nasty figure from their high school. And obviously, the next move is just to change the name of the high school because Jefferson's such a disgustingly evil, wicked, right, person. One of the removalists, as I call them, Tristan Crowell, said, when it came down, we could tell something had happened. This was a moment in history, at least in the city. And then he went on to say, there should be a line at the Civil War. Every forefather prior to that should be considered a Confederate. There's no point in having these statues, right? Uh, Another youngster, Rosario Navalta, she was 21 years old and she was part of the activism. She said, all they do, and they meaning the statues, remind everybody of the history of the United States and its role in perpetuating white supremacy and the institutionalization of anti-blackness, right? And she went on to talk about Thomas Jefferson's role as slave owner, owning over 600 slaves and having four children with Sally Hemings. Now, Navalta and Crowell are illustrations of the rage of many of our youths today, thousands and perhaps tens of thousands of removalists, right, who acts on profound ignorance of the history of our country, right? And what I find even worse is they behave as if they are fit representatives, a 21 and a 26-year-old person, acting on behalf of all of us, as if their actions speak loudly for what all of us feel and all of us think coming concerning Thomas Jefferson, right? Um, Consider his Crowell's comment. We could tell something had happened. What a profoundly naive comment. Something I'll get back. Well, but what was it? What did happen, right? Use like this iterate and reiterate bromitically, right? And their iterations and reiterations are accompanied oftentimes by acts of violence, um, vandalism, let's call it, if not violence, acts of vandalism that are tolerated by others. And the only reason that they're tolerated is because if we don't tolerate them, we're considered to be racist, right? Now, Navalta claims that statues do nothing more than remind us of our hatred of black people and of white supremacy. That seems to be a profoundly naive comment, a comment of purest cynicism. You know, it seems to me we live in a time where everybody wants or has something to say, and very few of us are willing to listen. Everybody has something to say, something to get off their chest. Everybody is bothered, everybody is angered, everybody is hurt by things other people say and do, or people in the past have said and done, right? And that's the problem with an empty democracy where everybody feels himself that he is himself fit to represent the interest of all of the people. It's not what a democracy is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about actions pursuant to the interests of the majority. And as Jefferson would say in his first inaugural address, an enlightened majority that's done its homework and knows what's going on in the world around them. but just democracy, as Plato talks of in books 8 and 9 of his Republic, in which everybody walks around and thinks he is himself fit to rule all other people. You have everybody walking around thinking that way. Of course, you have nothing but pure tohu bohu, pure chaos. Uh, right. Maybe we should follow Crowell's advice and draw a line, right? Draw a line right at the Civil War. Uh, you know, and what was his line? He talks of every white forefather prior to the Civil War, right? And which is suggestive of there being forefathers after the Civil War, which shows the ignorance of Crowell's claim, right? Forefathers prior. Talks of all the forefathers prior to the Civil War, as if there were some after the Civil War, right? Okay, so we draw a line, and everybody prior to the Civil War who was white must be considered a racist, okay? And everybody after that, we can be open-minded about people after. We can only judge them upon their actions or some such thing. Of course, this bespeaks profound ignorance, right? Slavery was not confined to the South, right? Um, there were prominent slave owners in the North, and when Lincoln gives his Emancipation Proclamation on the 1st of January in 1863, right, it applied only to slaves in the rebellious states, right? It had nothing to do with people in the non-rebellious states and their slaves. They could keep their slaves, presumably. Slavery wasn't a, a, a breaking deal. It wasn't the large issue for Lincoln. If we follow what he said, it says it's preserving the Union was and Lincoln had said, if I can preserve it by avoiding the issue of slavery, that's fine. The issue was preserving the Union. Okay, it seems to me that his Emancipation Proclamation, if you study the issue carefully, was a political maneuver, right, designed to gain sort of moral sympathy for the cause of the Northerners in their fight with the South. To me, the Civil War, and I think this is correct view, was essentially about the South's constitutional right to secede if they wanted to secede, not essentially about slavery, right? Um, the North had saddled the South with numerous economic burdens, and they were feeding off economically off the South. And in addition to that, Lincoln had sent some 75,000 troops, right, uh, to Carolina. And it seems to me that the South was in a position where they could do little but declare war. Now, a second point is that symbols like the statue of Jefferson are not monolithic in their meaning. And by that, I mean, she's the one who said that, all of us, when we look at a statue of Jefferson, think of hatred of blacks and think of white supremacy. Well, that's a egregiously false claim. It might apply to some people who are trained to look at statues like that and think that way, right? Um, but they're not monolithically meaningful in terms of different people see different things in the statues. For example, I live in Lynchburg, and there is a large monument to General Jubal Early in Lynchburg, and he was a hero of the Civil War in Lynchburg because he fought off General David Hunter's Union troops who was advancing, and he had many more troops in number than did Early, and through a little bit of trickery and Early convinced Hunter to retreat and so forth. And Hunter did retreat, and Lynchburg was saved. So he was a hero. Now, there's no question that, this, when I see that monument, I'm always considered that, but Early was a racist. He thought that blacks were inferior to whites and was not shy about saying that. But he his reasons for fighting for the South were because it was dictated by his state. And I read from him. He says, "The adoption of that ordinance wrung from me bitter tears of grief, but I at once recognized my duty to abide the decision of my native state and to defend her soil against invasion. I recognize the right of resistance and revolution as exercised by our fathers in 1776, and without cavil as to the name by which it was called, I entered the military service of my state willingly, cheerfully, and zealously. So, in other words, the deciding factor for General Jubal Early was Virginia calling all its citizens to duty to fight on behalf of the South. And Early did just that, right? So Early felt a duty to follow the decisions of his native state, Virginia. Question I have: would youngsters like Crowley and Navalta put their life on the line on behalf of the things that they believe, if they are so against white supremacy, as they call it, and hatred of blacks, if an event called them to fight on behalf of those causes, would they do so? I suspect that they wouldn't. I suspect that toppling a statue is just as far as each was willing to go, right? Um, Notice that Crowell talks of this was a moment in history. Something had happened, right? Has given him quick celebrity on the internet, right? What was it that was so important? You know, he never says something has happened. It was a moment in history. Well, I took my dog the other week for a swim, his first swim in the James River. You know, that was a moment in history. Something had happened, right? And it was important to me and my dog in some sense, but I doubt that it would be important enough for any historian to put it in a book as a prominent fact or prominent event in the history of the city of Lynchburg. Okay. Um, it's difficult to, well, another thing that bothers me, a large botheration here, is to reduce the life of a figure like a Jefferson or a John Adams or whomever to one or a couple things. He owned slaves, so he was a racist, and so we reduce it to one thing, and we tell that the life story of that person by telling a story of that one thing about the person's naive ignorance, a person's hatred of blacks, and the person's belief in white supremacy. All this is a matter of projecting, I think, onto the past, right? Um, I would say that if removalists would take the time to study U.S. history, study the causal, the ideological intricacies of events, and it's impossible for any historian to capture any one event, right? With all like the Civil War, even the life of Thomas Jefferson, we select certain things, and we do so, if you're doing history the right way, we do so with an eye to capturing the essence of the person, not creating a monster, not creating a Frankenstein, like a lot of people like to do today. Uh, and people, you know, looking at statues today tend to see more in the statues than they ought to see, and it's an aggravating thing. Um, Now, I would say, you know, the problem with encouraging people to study history is that it asks people to read books. People don't like to read books today. That's work. It's easier to go ahead and take our ropes and stuff, put them on statues, and pull the statues down and clap, clap, clap. We've done something important, even though we don't know anything about these figures other than a couple things that are spoon fed us through the media or through sources like Monticello. Um, I think, you know, removing symbols that seem to us causes, or symbols that seem to us reminders of our country's racial past is a bad thing. To me, it tends to aggravate more Americans because of the reductionist behavior involved in it, that reducing the life of one person to one event, right? And it's not like, you know, it's the whole thing out of sight, out of mind. If we remove the person, right, we remove the problem. And you know, look at the point I want to make is our history is our history. This is our history. Jefferson is a part of our history. So was Martin Luther King. So all the other people, members of the Ku Klux Klan, of the, any person who was part of our country and lived in it, and whether they did good or bad, this is part of our history. We need to embrace it one way or another. I would argue, we'll look at the Colosseum in Rome, right? There were sanguinary gladiatorial games played there. Should we raise the Colosseum because of that? Should we raise the Cathedral of Notre Dame because of the Crusades, right? Um, should we remove all symbols of Martin Luther King because we know he was a rampant womanizer? I would suggest if Navalta feels pain, it's her pain, it's her guilt, uh, um, and the evil is in her mind, not as in the statue so much, right? Um, so to think that if we can remove the statue, we remove the problem, that's sophomoric reasoning. It can't be done, right? So the point I'm trying to make, this is our past in our symbols, like Jubal Early, who was racist without question by today's standards, but he's also a hero of the Southern Civil War and a very brave man who saved the lives of many thousands of people in Lynchburg, presumably, by his actions, by causing Hunter to retreat. Martin Luther King was a womanizer, but he also did a lot of good. But these are two figures of our past, and we ought to embrace them, whoever they were. If someone feels pain by looking at a statue of Robert E. Lee, well, that's your pain. Get over it, figure something out, right? People like young people like Crowell and Navalta, they can't do that, right? Because they use the language and the actions of segregation, right? They talk of they don't talk of our past. It's their past. It's the past of those people, of those races. It's not our past. They don't take ownership of these people and these actions. America's past is not theirs, right? We sort of separate ourselves into the racists and to the non-racists. Um, I don't see it that way, as I said. Um, Now, would the world be a better place if if General Jubal Early never existed, if Thomas Jefferson never existed, Martin Luther King never existed? I don't know that I'm in a position to say that, but as I said before, it's my past, and I need to take ownership. And every country has its own problems along these lines. It's the people that, that remind them of the bad that went on in that country, and people that remind them of what was great with the country. I leave you with um, a thought from Jean Piaget, the great psychologist, the great French psychologist. Growth is essentially a painful process, and without it, without enduring the pain, we can't grow. So we just need to accept our figures for who they are and understand they are part of our past, right? Um, if people like Navalta and Crowell would study, would read books before they acted, would know what who Thomas Jefferson was. Perhaps if they would get to know the real Thomas Jefferson, I think it clear that they would never have taken part in such a silly activity as they did when they toppled the statue of Thomas Jefferson at Thomas Jefferson High School in Portland, Oregon. But that's Portland, Oregon, and a lot of very weird things go on there. That's all for today, and take care. And thank you very much for watching, and do this again, episode 4, TTFN.